Alright, so week 10. Hooray for arbitrary checkpoints of a double-digit week. Managed to stick with it for 10 weeks. I'm kind of proud of that. But this week, unfortunately, did not have nearly as much fanfare as I would have liked it to. I would have definitely preferred to do something fantastic this week, because again, arbitrary checkpoint week 10. Woo! But instead of arbitrary checkpoints and celebratory things to add into the game, I instead went in and fixed bugs. And I spent basically the entire week fixing 2 bugs. They were very hard bugs to fix. So basically, the first bug was really a big issue. So I noticed that the statue enemies, when I would go up and use the combo node to move them on my developer mode input, it would function okay and it would work just fine, right? But when I switched over to the MIDI input, that's where the main game is going to be played from, they wouldn't respond to you at all. And this was coming from the fact that the MIDI input and the developer input are 2 separate inputs in the game at that point. And I had initially intended for it to be transparent for the game, right? The inputs would just use that Godot's action system and then add actions to the input system to queue. They basically make it their own action, so it would be invisible to the game where the hardware spawning those actions is coming from, right? This didn't work because, and I know kind of now why it didn't work, because I spent so long fixing this bug. Godot's MIDI system, as far as I can tell, and I'd be open to being told this was wrong, but as far as I can tell, it runs on a separate thread from the main thread of the game, right? And this other thread limits it a little bit. Yes, it's useful for certain logic things and for responding to the game, and ultimately, yeah, you can use it. But there's a lot of stuff that you can't do in the threads that the MIDI input spawns that you can do in the main thread of the game, right? So, for example, the move and collide function, which is what the player uses to move around the screen, relies on the main thread. It actually, you can go into the Godot source code, and I did while I was debugging this, to open that up and see, hey, this intentionally errors if it's not running on the main thread. Because I'm assuming, I'm not super familiar with the Godot C++ code base, but I'm assuming that if it's not run on the main thread, something bad would happen, right? It would get buggy behavior, so someone somewhere went in and said, hey, we're not going to allow it to run on any thread that's not the main thread, right? So what this means is that when you try to move the player from just directly the MIDI input, it doesn't move at all. In fact, nothing happens. The player responds to it properly, all the abilities run properly, but the movement function just doesn't work because it uses that move and collide function to get around the screen. This fix was not simple to go ahead and do. I spent a lot of time experimenting with a lot of different solutions, trying to see if maybe this would work, maybe this alternative could work, and eventually I just came to the conclusion that I had to somehow trick it into running on the main thread, which really that wasn't too hard to do. Once I finally came to that conclusion, I was able to really quickly, rapidly experiment with different things that I thought working, and ultimately what I came around to using was sending a signal on the MIDI input and then catching that signal on the main thread and use that. Or I assume it catches it on the main thread because it works all right. And yeah, that works great. There was one downside with this that induced the second bug that I fixed this week. That was a really big issue. So even though it appeared to be right on the main thread, when you would load a new scene using the MIDI inputs, the game would crash. And I don't just mean crash, the game engine would crash without giving any error messages in the debugging output. So it would seriously crash the game, right? It's not just crashing the game at this point, it's crashing the game with no debug output statements, which is a good indicator that whatever is going on is not, it's not anticipated behavior. It's not like when you mess up something in GDScript and the game goes, oh, this is invalid script, I know how to throw an error for this. This is an error with the game engine that's not working, right? So I spent a lot of time fighting with this error. And I went in, I looked around for stuff, I experimented with stuff, and eventually I came across a Stack Overflow post, not a Stack Overflow post, it was a bug inside the GitHub repository, or an open bug inside the Godot repository that basically said Godot has issues loading resources on different threads. So again, something is going on with the MIDI input not running on the main thread, right? And when you go over, Godot tries to load the new scenes on that MIDI thread instead of the main thread, and all sorts of errors happen. You actually go into the Godot documentation, and it says right up front, don't load stuff when you're not in the main thread. It's not a thread-safe operation. Bad things happen, right? So obviously this is bad, right? I had hoped that movement would all be in the main thread, but clearly something is being induced that's causing it to run the main thread. So I needed to ensure that the new resources would load in the main thread instead of whatever thread the MIDI system's running on. So in order to do that, I said, okay, well, first, I tried lots of different things. Again, anything that I could think of that might get it running on the main thread instead of the MIDI thread in GDScript I tried doing. Eventually, I came to the solution that I needed to signal the main thread somehow, and then have that main thread take that signal and then load the new scene. So that's what I ended up doing. I actually have a process function that checks for a flag, and if that flag is true, it's going to load the new scene. That way it runs on the main thread instead of the side thread. I'm not happy with this solution. It does work, and it does everything I need it to for the game. It runs okay. It runs properly. There's no errors now when it loads, and as far as I can tell, the rest of the game's running okay, although, admittedly, further testing of that should be advised in the future, but from the small test that I've run, it seems to be working properly and fine. The issue is that it makes load times longer, because you have to wait for the process function to get around to loading the new zone, and it's noticeably longer than it was before, which really bugs me. We don't want long load times, right? So I think in the future, I might have to go in and learn a little bit more of the underlying code base of the engine in Godot, and then start maybe implementing some sort of module for a custom MIDI function or MIDI inputs that run on the main thread as opposed to the side thread or wherever else they're running, and then hopefully use that to clean up the code in that module with the game, in addition to all the GG script files and asset files and whatnot. But yeah, once I got those two bugs mostly fixed, again, still need to go in and check out the lower layer source code, but once I got those bugs working and functional, I figured, okay, there's not really a lot of time left in the week, because you got to realize I was debugging those and figuring out what was going wrong with those for lots and lots and lots of time, because figuring out what's wrong with the bug is, again, a lengthy process where you got to follow functions and then see where this function is getting called and why this function is getting called, and it's even worse when it's in the underlying system as opposed to your system. But after I spent all that time doing that, there wasn't a lot of time left to work on the next feature, so I knew I had to work on something pretty light, but something that would benefit the upcoming content area. And the first thing that came to my mind was doors, right? Because the statue switch needs something to interact with. A switch without an object to respond to it is useless, right? There's no point using it in the game at all because it doesn't do anything. So I figured, okay, a basic thing that I could do is just a door. It locks the player's position until they finish interacting with the switch, and that was pretty easy. I went and made the artwork for it. So for the artwork for the door, actually, I ended up using Inkscape again, mainly because the Godot animator does not allow you, well, it's not that it doesn't allow it. No, yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't have a feature that will cut off a sprite after it passes a certain Y value without shaders. You could theoretically implement it with shaders, but I decided to go the Inkscape route so I didn't have extra shader code running. Admittedly, that wouldn't have hurt performance very much, but the Inkscape route would be faster to implement, and again, this was a quick implementation feature, right? I didn't have a lot of time left in the week to get this done, so I thought, okay, Inkscape will be faster, and really it is. Plus, animating a door in Inkscape like this is not hard. You just move a sprite down a couple of frames and then export those. It's not bad at all. So yeah, once I did that, I then went in and I implemented a side version of the door, and this one I didn't want to animate in Inkscape because I was having to fiddle around with the downwards motion of it a lot with the perspective that it was at. So I figured, okay, I need something that I can fiddle around with and iterate rapidly. So I actually exported this SVG into Blender and then used the Blender animation software to animate that SVG. And I'm actually really happy with that, even though it took a lot of time to actually get the SVG exported into Blender, because when you export it in, all of the SVGs are in the same Z layer. And actually, that's a really good feature that would benefit Blender to add, is have imported SVG files be offset into the Z dimension based on their Z index inside of the SVG file they're coming from. But once I implemented all of that, I went in and I fiddled around with the code a little bit. It took me a little bit of time to get all of the signals and stuff working right, but it really wasn't that hard of a thing to implement. It was just some basic logic. And once that was done, I had pretty much working doors. The one thing that's notable with these doors is that the side one doesn't necessarily have proper Y sorting yet. That's a thing that I'm going to have to fix next week, because there's the node wants Y sorting in two different locations. So the front of it wants Y sorting to be at the bottom, and the top of it wants Y sorting to be at the top, if you allow me to anthropomorphize the Inhuman sprites for a second. And basically what this means is no matter where you put the Y sorting for the node, it's always going to be wrong at some point inside of, or at some point when the player's navigating around in a circle. So I'm going to have to go in and, I think, separate it into two different sprites, one of which is a Z index above the other, so it's always appearing in front of the player, and one is always appearing behind the player, so when they go through the gateway, it looks proper when they move on to the next scene. But yeah, that was pretty much it for this week. Not a lot of stuff, unfortunately. Well, actually a lot of stuff. 2 bug fixes that were of that magnitude is actually a lot of work that went into that, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of extra content added, which is really unfortunate, 'cause I like showing things that, showing new content and trying stuff that works. But hey, it's the real world. Sometimes you gotta debug stuff, But yeah, that's pretty much it for week 10. Woohoo, double digits. Next week on to week 11. Fancy prime number week. Anyways, yeah, bye. See you then.